How is religion changing? In this video, we're going to talk about how religion is changing globally, and then we're going to focus particularly on the United States. First, we're just briefly going to talk about how we measure religion. Then we're going to talk about some global trends. Then we'll look at overall trends in the United States. Then we'll look at religious nones, that is, people with no religion in the United States. Then we'll look at religious conservatives. Then we'll talk about the future of religion. First, let's briefly talk about how we even measure religion to begin with. And I just want to acknowledge that measuring religion is really hard. There are three main ways that social scientists have come up with to measure religion. It's identity, belief, and behavior. And these often contradict each other. A person's religious identity is just what groups do they belong to. Their belief has to do with what do they believe? Do they believe in a God? Do they believe in prayer? Do they believe that Jesus is their savior, for example? And then their behavior has to do with what they do with that. Do you attend religious services? Do you pray? Religious identity, belief, and behavior often contradict each other and interact in ways that social scientists wouldn't predict that they would interact. You'll have people who say they're Catholic who have literally never been to Mass in their lives or know anything about the Catholic belief system. You'll have other people who say they are non-religious but hold all the beliefs of traditional Christianity. You can see how complicated this is. So social scientists really like to combine multiple measures, which is why we like to use multiple surveys if possible. So now let's look at some global trends. Here's the picture of religion across the globe. 30% of people globally say that they're Christian. 22% of people globally identify as Muslim, 14% as Hindu, 11% other religions, 11% non-religious, 7% Buddhist, and even though Jews are a very small category, I went ahead and put them in here because they've been so influential in world history. I thought you might be curious about the percentage of Jews. Jews are 0.2% of the global population. Now let's look at some of these categories separately because we can find some really interesting information about them globally. The number of Christians in the world is generally remaining pretty stable, although it is decreasing in Europe, mainly because of slow generational shifts. Across the globe, Catholics account for 55% of all Christians, and Protestants account for 20% of all Christians. Those are the two groups that are the most common in the United States. Muslims are the only religious group that shows a consistent upward trend relative to world population. So if you're thinking about the future of global religion, if things continue the way that they are now, which is a really big if, things always change, things always happen. But if the world was to continue the way that it is now, we would expect that Muslims would become the most popular religion globally at some point in the future. Islam is increasing in a lot of regions of the world, but most notably in Europe. By the year 2010, 75% of Europeans were Christian, 14% of Europeans were non-religious, and 10% of Europeans were Muslim. And this change in the number of Muslims in Europe is mostly due to immigration. Now let's look at the non-religious. I do want to say the numbers for non-religious people are absolutely all over the place. I've seen some studies that claim that only 10% of the world is non-religious. I've seen other studies that claim that over 30% of the world is non-religious. And this is because non-religious people are difficult to define and difficult to measure. Saying that people are non-religious is especially tricky because there are some countries in the world that persecute religion and encourage people to identify as non-religious, even if those people secretly might have a religious shrine, hidden away in a closet somewhere where they think the authorities can't see it. Non-religious people grew from 1945 to 1980, and then they declined because of the collapse of USSR. Specifically, Eastern Europeans were able to reclaim their religious identities after the collapse of the USSR. Now, I do want to point out here that non-religious does not necessarily mean atheist. I know a lot of people take the word non-religious as equivalent to atheist, but that is completely wrong. In fact, most non-religious people are not atheists. People may be forced to disavow religion for political reasons, which we've already talked about. Some people just don't think about religion at all, positively or negatively. They aren't pro-religion, they aren't anti-religion. Usually these people will say, I'm just too busy for religion. Lots of the non-religious believe in spiritual ideas like belief in a God, belief in a higher power. They just don't like organized religion. And some people who are non-religious aren't actively rejecting organized religion. They just kind of feel spiritual and have never bothered to try to identify a religion that they feel closest to. So non-religious may mean atheist, but most of the time it doesn't. So now let's zoom in and look at overall patterns in the United States. The overall trend in the US is secularization. Secularization means a decline of traditional religious either identity, belief, or practice. And that's what we see in the United States. There's been a decline in religiousness in the United States. Religious affiliation, attendance, and belief have all declined for decades. In 1957, only 5% of Americans said they had no religious affiliation, but by 2012, 20% said they had no religious affiliation. In 1965, 40% of Americans attended church, but by 1993, only 27% attended church. In the 1990s, about 17% of Americans engaged in religious participation beyond attending services, but by the 2000s, only 11% did religious activities beyond services. In 1990, 13% of people never attended religious services, but by 2014, 26% of people never attended religious services. I want to note that in the past, people who stopped believing would usually continue attending. Church was a big part of people's social lives, so it wasn't necessarily about whether you believed or not. But today, if people stop believing, they usually stop attending. In the 1950s, 99% of people said that they believed in God, but by 2014, only 91% of Americans said that they believed in God. In 1986, 40% of people said that the Bible should be taken literally, but by 2016, only 30% of Americans said that the Bible should be taken literally. And finally, let's look at the people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. In 1998, only 9% of people described themselves as spiritual but not religious, but by 2014, 17% of people described themselves as spiritual but not religious. And this happened because non-religious people are increasingly likely to describe themselves as spiritual and then not attend religious services. So this kind of slow secularization is definitely the biggest trend in U.S. religion. You can see that the numbers aren't hugely dramatic. It's not like 20 years ago, almost everyone believed in God and now almost nobody does. It's not like that. But we can see a slow shift in the number of people who are identifying with a particular religion, who are believing, and who are attending or engaging in religious behavior. Overall, we're seeing a decline in religiousness in the United States. Now let's focus on the religious nuns. We're looking here at the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. These are the people that on surveys, when they're asked, what is your religion, will say, none, I have no religion. This is completely different than religious nuns, N-U-N-S, as in, the movie Sister Act. In social sciences, when we're talking about the people who have no religion, they're called religious nuns. In the United States, the religious nuns have grown. In 1990, they were about 7% of the population. In 1999, they were about 14% of the population. And by 2012, they were about 20% of the population. So one of the big questions for social scientists who study religion in the past decades has been, why are more Americans rejecting religion and saying that their religion is none? Let's look here at some of the major theories that social scientists have come up with and tested for why people are rejecting religion. The first major theory is just generational replacement, also called cohort replacement. This is just the idea that one generation is different than the next. Generations tend to become more and more liberal over time. That's what we've seen in the past several hundred years. And as generations shift, maybe religion is shifting along with it. And there is quite a bit of evidence for this. In fact, I would say that this is probably the leading theory with the most data behind it. Researchers say that this slow trend of moving away from religiousness actually started in the early 1900s. It's not a new thing at all. Since then, religious affiliation, church attendance, and firm belief in God have all fallen from one birth cohort to the next. And this is just kind of a self-reinforcing cycle. Parents are slightly less religious, which decreases the religiousness of the next generation, which then decreases the religiousness of the next generation. Generational replacement operates very slowly, and it can be reversed temporarily by things like some kind of religious revival that sweeps the country. But because it's such a long-term shift, it's very hard to actually reverse it. Children are raised by parents who are less religious than their parents were, and this slowly reshapes culture over time. Let's look at another major theory that social scientists have for why this rise of the nuns could be happening. Some social scientists claim that people are rejecting the tenets of faith. This theory says that as people become more familiar with science, they're more likely to reject spiritual and religious explanations in life. Both rationalism, which is learning to think through things logically, and pluralism, which is that we're all exposed to lots of different cultures and religions and ways of life, both of those make religion easier to question. Now, here's the thing. Research on this is mixed. When researchers ask religious nuns why they are leaving religion, almost half of them give answers that sound a lot like this. For example, answers like, I don't believe in miracles, or I left because of data and logic, or I left because of lack of evidence. However, there are other surveys of thousands of people that will survey people on their religious viewpoints, asking all kinds of questions like, what religion do you belong to? And then some people will check the box none, so you can take those people out of the survey and look at their other answers to questions like, do you believe in a God? Do you believe Jesus is your savior? Do you believe the Bible is inspired? And what's surprising is a lot of the people who say they have no religion will follow all the basic tenets of a Christian faith. They believe in a God. They believe in life after death. They believe in heaven or hell. A lot of them still believe in Satan. A lot of them believe the Bible is inspired. So that evidence would suggest that people aren't becoming religious nuns because they don't believe anymore. Instead, they seem to be alienated from organized religion somehow. The word for these groups of people is either unchurched believers, or another phrase that social scientists use a lot is believing without belonging. So there's an interesting discrepancy here in the research where some researchers believe that nuns are rejecting the tenets of their faith, and other researchers say no, they aren't. They believe all the tenets of the faith, they're just rejecting the term religious. I think future researchers are going to have to sort this out. There's another theory that social scientists have why people are checking the box none when you ask them what is their religion, and that is that people are rejecting organized religion. This theory says that people reject the bureaucratic structure of church and church's narrow focus on certain moral ideas that the people may or may not agree with. For example, there is some evidence that people have left the Catholic Church because of its rulings on abortion and contraception, even if those people continue to believe all the tenets of the Catholic faith. There was also some research that looked specifically at church scandals, like the Catholic Church's sex scandal, and saw that people were rejecting organized religion because they might feel like a lot of churches are hypocritical. And you can see this in surveys of religious nuns where they say things like, I don't like hierarchy. I think religion is too much like a business. Or I left because of the clergy sex abuse scandals. So it does seem as though some religious nuns are frustrated with church as an organization, and that is separate from what they believe. Then there's another theory social scientists have about why people are becoming nuns at higher rates, and that is that people are embracing spirituality more. People see religiousness and spirituality as two separate things. They often see religiousness as having to do with rules and hierarchy and telling other people what to do, whereas they see spirituality as their personal connection with a God or a higher power. And a lot of people are embracing spirituality and rejecting religion. These people will say things like, I believe in God, but in my own way. Or I'm seeking enlightenment, or I'm open-minded. So possibly some religious nuns are embracing spirituality more than they're rejecting religion. Let's look at one last really famous theory about what's going on. In social science circles, this theory is very famous. Some people claim that the rise of the religious nuns is really about politics. They say that the marriage of religion and politics in the past 30 or 40 years in the United States has turned some people away from religion. The rise of the religious right, the strong association a lot of people have between religiousness and being a Republican has turned a lot of people away who otherwise would consider themselves religious. People, rightly or wrongly, associate being religious with being Republican. And people associate being Republican with being racist, specifically anti-Black, being anti-immigrant, anti-poor, anti-gay, anti-trans, and anti-women. Republicans may protest and say, that's not who we really are. You're free to do that. But what I'm saying is a lot of Americans have that association, and we can prove it with survey data. So what we're seeing is political moderates and political liberals are less likely now to label themselves as religious. The younger generation values personal autonomy when it comes to both sex and drugs, and that generation, specifically the people who value that autonomy, are more likely to label themselves as religious nuns. There's also a lot of data showing that religious nuns are more likely to be Democrats and politically liberal. During this period of time when nuns have increased so much in the United States, it is notable that political conservatives generally did not change their religious preferences. Only political liberals and moderates did. Democrats, but not Republicans, have reduced their religious service attendance. So there is quite a bit of data to support this theory that the rise of religious nuns is actually about the marriage of religion and politics in the United States and the rise of the religious right. Now let's zero in on another trend in the United States: religious conservatives. Let's talk about the group of people who are sometimes labeled religious conservatives, sometimes labeled evangelicals, sometimes labeled fundamentalists. I know that all of those are technically different things, but the way people use those terms in everyday life is often interchangeable. We've already talked about the fact that the overall trend in the US is toward less religiousness, but that overall trend really masks the details here. Religious liberals have become less religious and stopped going to church as often. Religious moderates have also stopped going to church and become less religious. But religious conservatives are holding strong. Fundamentalism in the United States is strong and possibly even growing. Since 1989, the percentage of people in the United States who are religiously unaffiliated has doubled. Those with very weak religious affiliations have moved over into the unaffiliated category. So people who were only weakly religious before have now moved to no religion. But those with strong affiliations have remained stable. Among all religious people, those with strong affiliations are now making up a larger and larger percentage of the religious people in the United States. And this pattern holds true whether you're looking at religious identification or prayer frequency or attendance or Bible literalism or evangelicalism. If you're thinking that religion has become more and more conservative in the United States, you're not wrong. That is absolutely true because the liberals and the moderates are falling away from religion entirely, and the only people who are left are the fundamentalists, the conservatives, the evangelicals. Sometimes people look at religion in the United States and assume that the US is becoming more religious, but that's not actually true. It's just that the religious people who are left are more intense, they're more fundamentalists, and they have more power. But when you're thinking about this, keep in mind that fundamentalists don't represent most Americans. You can see this same trend by looking at support for prayer and Bible reading in school. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a big decline in support for prayer and Bible reading in school. Then, from the 1980s through the 2000s, there was only a moderate decline in support for prayer and Bible reading in school. So overall, the picture is of Americans supporting prayer and Bible reading in school a lot less than they did in the 1960s. But if you break the evangelicals out in this picture, you'll find that they are even more in support of prayer and Bible reading in school than they were in the past. So an average American might hear a lot more support for these ideas from evangelicals and assume that America is becoming more religiously conservative when really it's not. Most evangelical Republicans are staying put in their churches even when they have serious political differences with the congregation. They're usually so deeply embedded in that congregation that they just find a way to work through their political differences rather than leaving. So we're seeing that religious and political conservatives are staying in their religion while moderates and liberals are leaving. Now let's transition to looking at the future of religion. By the year 2070, if nothing changes and religious trends continue, there should be around 35 to 54% of the US that identifies as Christian. There should be around 34 to 52% of the US that identifies with no religion. They're religious nuns. So no matter how you model it, the nuns will approach or exceed Christians by the year 2070. Now this projection is based on understanding religious composition by age and sex. Then you factor in things like birth rates and migration patterns, and you have a model of religious switching as well that comes into play. Even if nobody switches religions at all in the future, which is highly unlikely, Christianity will still shrink in comparison to other religions in the United States, which will grow because of immigration patterns. Now, I want to emphasize all of this depends on continuing current trends. All kinds of things could change the current trends, such as war, an economic depression, a climate crisis, changing immigration patterns, new religions, and religious revivals. Social scientists are absolutely notorious for not being able to predict the future because current trends are often disrupted. So take this as just, if everything continues on the path that we're on now, this is what 2070 will probably look like. But will everything probably continue exactly as it has been? No, probably not. The one thing we can count on the future to bring us is something weird and unexpected. But the US may be taking the same path as Western Europe. In Great Britain, the nuns became a larger group than the Christians in the year 2009. The Netherlands effectively left Christianity much earlier in the 1970s. So it's possible that the US will take the same path as Great Britain and the Netherlands and lots of other countries in Europe. It's also possible we won't. Let's summarize. Both global and US data show decreasing religiousness, except among Muslims. Muslims are growing globally, but they are the only group that is growing consistently. Religious nuns, people with no religious preference, are a larger and larger percentage of the US population every year. In the US, liberals and moderates have mostly started rejecting religion. They've stopped attending church in as high of numbers. So the only people who are left are the religious conservatives, the evangelicals, the fundamentalists. For that reason, even though the US as a whole is becoming more religiously liberal, religion itself is becoming more conservative in the US. And this trend can give the illusion that religiousness is increasing in the US, even though it's actually not. If current trends continue, which is a huge if, but if current trends continue, the US will have more religious nuns than Christians by the year 2070.